My son stole my savings for Paris, the shocking betrayal on my 75th birthday. The doorbell rang at exactly 8:17 a.m. I checked the clock before I opened the door, because habits are comforts we keep when the rest of the world feels uncertain. I wasn't expecting anyone. I had made coffee, buttered a slice of toast, and set a single place at the little table by the window, where sunlight slanted across the dust motes like tiny confetti that forgot how to celebrate. On the mat lay a card, thin paper with a florid script I recognized as Andrew's, the looped A he'd learned from summer letters home during college. The roses tucked into the envelope were already wilting, petals curled like old paper. The card said, in an economy of words and emojis that felt wrong from my son's hand, "Happy 75th, Mom. We miss you. Love, Andrew and Patricia." There was a photograph tucked inside. 3 faces in front of the Seine, the Eiffel Tower blurred behind them. Andrew's arm around Patricia, Emily smiling, hair braided like a crown. They were in Paris. They were toasting with a bottle of something that cost more than my weekly groceries. They had chosen Paris instead of being here. It landed on me like a cold hand. I set the card on the counter, and because I am a creature of small rituals, I opened my laptop to the bank website. It was nothing heroic, just to check balances, remind myself which checks cleared, which bills were due. The numbers refused to be comforting. I scrolled out of habit, the kind of motion that used to be calming, and the calming dissolved like sugar in hot coffee. 9 years of withdrawals faced me in neat clinical rows. They began slowly, smaller sums that might be explained away as accidental transfers, gifts, or a help to Andrew in a pinch. But over time, the pattern hardened into a grammar of theft. Airline reservations to Paris, reservations at hotels with names I'd never heard, a string of charges at boutiques in the 6th arrondissement, upscale restaurants, ticket purchases to shows. The sums added, and then they added more, repeated, methodical, a steady siphon that, by the time my eyes swallowed the final total, read in a way that left my hands shaky. $347,000, give or take, taken from accounts that were supposed to be my safety net. I stared at the spreadsheet until my coffee grew cold. The outrage came like a taut wire snapping. First the incredulous shock, this could not be, then a slow, steady indignation that felt less like fire and more like iron being found in the center of a calm heart. How did he get access? Why did no alarm go off? The questions arrived in a rush and then clustered like small, persistent birds. There are things one imagines never having to do at 75. Confronting your son for a betrayal of this sort was on that list, somewhere between learning how to use a smartphone and breaking a hip. But Richard had always said, plan for what you can. Plan for what you cannot. Richard, who loved rules and architecture and the exact angles of justice, had left me with plans more meticulous than I suspected. The envelope from Andrew and the picture of Paris became a private sort of mockery, somebody else's party. I left the bank window open and walked into the bedroom where Richard's study had been turned into a small shrine of books, brass fittings, and the sort of tidy chaos that made him smile. On his desk sat a small brass key in a leather dish, the kind of object that seems ordinary until the moment it isn't. I had thought it a forgotten key to the old safe deposit box. I had never, until that morning, supposed the key would be part of a revelation. Behind the study door, I found the sealed envelope he'd meant me to find when the time came. There was no unnecessary drama. A plain envelope, my name written in his steady hand, and beneath it a small flash drive that looked like a relic of an earlier, less elegant age, its cheap plastic casing scratched, its tiny light dimmed from disuse. The envelope smelled faintly of cedar and dust and the leather of his gloves. My fingers trembled as I slit it. "Ellie," the letter began. Richard's voice existed in handwriting for me, precise and patient. He had known me long enough to know that I would read the opening and look for the punchline, the instruction, the reason. He had planned for my 75th birthday because he had planned for everything. He had written a letter that assumed the worst and trusted me to be better for it. In the margins, he had included specifics, account names, the name of the trust he'd established in secret years ago, and the brass key's intended use. He had explained, briefly, without flourish, that the trust was a shadow of sorts, deliberately separate from the visible accounts, created to protect the collection we had built together. His rare first editions, the annotated plays he treasured, the brittle pamphlets from a century ago that smelled like fog and foxglove. He had feared there might come a time when someone within the family would decide entitlement trumped decency, and he had used his legal mind to build a small fortress. The plan was not meant as a punishment. It was meant as a test of character. He had written it with the coolness of someone who had seen the edge of human choices and wanted to make a line. There were instructions, how to access the trust, whom to call first, and a single line that stopped me. If this day reveals the worst, Ellie, you will know how to move. He did not specify the worst, except by implication. He did not name the thief, but he had written as if he expected the betrayal to be intimate. It landed with a peculiar clarity that made the room seem to breathe differently. I found the brass key hidden in a hollow of his desk, taped beneath a false bottom where he kept old coins and a photograph of our wedding. It fit into a lock I had not known existed inside the garden shed, behind a small metal box marked Jenkins Library. Inside sat a packet of folders, stamped copies of trust documents, and the flash drive that matched the one in the envelope. The flash drive contained scanned documents, handwritten drafts, legal forms, a list of accounts structured in a way that suggested he had built redundancy into his planning. He had given me instructions and the means to prove what had been mine all along. When I called Victor Harmon, I did it with a calm I did not entirely feel. Victor had been a friend of Richard's, a man who had once been a federal prosecutor and now managed trusts and estates for people who liked the sort of discretion my husband had prized. There was no sermonizing in his voice when he answered the phone. There was a steady, practical kindness that makes you feel as if you have someone with a map when you are walking through cracked ice. "You found the packet," he said on the third ring, as if he had been waiting. "I think someone has been taking from me," I said. "For years." There are words that set into motion systems. Claims of elder financial exploitation is one, and trust document is another. Victor came over with none of the pomp that other men sometimes bring when they assume they will be the leading voice. He brought a briefcase that smelled faintly of coffee and paper, and a notebook where he wrote as if the ink itself would keep things honest. Victor suggested a plan, in quiet, because that is the sort of man he is. First, inventory. Second, assemble people who would not be rattled by emotion, people who could treat an array of bank statements, emails, and receipts the way a scientist treats a specimen. Third, move swiftly enough that evidence would be preserved and accounts could be protected if necessary. At my age, move swiftly is a phrase that requires a translation. Victor's version of swift involved phone calls to banks, careful wording, documentation that respected the law and did not invite theatrical excess. He did not promise results. He spoke of options. He mentioned the difference between a civil claim, restitution, freezing assets, reversing unauthorized transfers, and the criminal avenues one might pursue. He said the word prosecutorial discretion as if it were an instrument rather than a threat. It calmed me to hear a man of law explain the kinds of levers we had and the kinds we did not. He also introduced me to Diana Reeves, who would be the one to comb the numbers. Diana arrived the next morning with a laptop and an expression that suggested she'd spent her life finding needles in haystacks. She had the sort of precision you imagine when someone says forensic accountant, not the grim cinematic variety, but the kind that is quiet and exact. She worked through the statements without judging me for my ignorance. She simply traced, connected, and annotated. Diana found the first anomaly in a way that was almost prosaic. a change in the pattern of logins, a repeated authorization from a device tied to Andrew's home address, small ATM withdrawals that correlated with dates when Emily's school break would have allowed for grandparents' babysitting, money that could be explained as help, but that, on aggregation, told another story. Her reports grew into a narrative the way a cartographer's lines on paper become a map. She rendered the money into movement, and movement became motive. When we sat with the printouts in the living room, the numbers spoke with a terrible clarity. They showed the timestamped charges, the cross-border purchases, and the transfers into an account that bore Andrew's middle initial in its title. They showed reimbursements that never were, checks cashed with signatures that, once Diana had compared them with known samples, did not match mine. Andrew was a lawyer, as the irony is almost theatrical. He is not a brazen thief in the movie sense. He had the kind of soft justifications that people wrap around theft to stay warm at night. Debt, a failed venture, the burden of an in-law's illness. Entitlement, faint but persistent. He had the means to fabricate plausibility. He also had the audacity to keep the expenditures intimate, flights booked under someone else's frequent flyer number, hotels charged to corporate accounts, a small trail of receipts that, at first glance, read like generosity. But Diana's work showed how generosity had become a vector for selfishness. The math was unambiguous. The intent was, for me, nearly so. We moved to action with more haste than I might have expected from someone who had spent decades as a librarian and curator. Victor drafted letters. Diana compiled exhibits. I found, beneath the shock, a reserve of coolness my friends had admired in me when I catalogued collections and refused to let sentiment rule inventory. There is a certain arithmetic to indignation. It can either swallow you or furnish you. I chose the latter. Catherine Ellington, an attorney who specialized in the rights of elders and who'd handled matters of guardianship and financial exploitation in the past, met us in the library with the same efficient kindness that had come to characterize everyone Richard had put within my reach. She explained in plain terms the options: revoke any existing power of attorney, petition the bank to freeze accounts on a showing of suspected wrongdoing, and consider civil action for restitution. She did not promise criminal charges would follow. She explained the burden of proof and the time it takes for courts to move when money is involved. We can act, she said. We cannot promise the gavel will fall the way you might hope, but we can secure resources so you are not left impoverished if the evidence supports that claim. The legalisms read to me like a foreign language until Victor translated them into the simple imperative I could understand: preserve evidence, limit further harm, and put the choice back where it belonged, with the person betrayed. The brass key, Richard's letter, and the flash drive were instruments of that preservation. They were, in their way, the last kindness my husband had offered me, an anticipatory rescue map, put into place before the storm. That afternoon, we sent certified letters and made discreet calls to bank compliance departments. We asked that suspicious activity be placed on hold, not frozen forever, because Catherine cautioned against overreach, but enough to halt the bleeding while we gathered a precise account. We did not shout our accusations in public. The initial approach was surgical rather than theatrical. The idea was to avoid tipping our hand before we had a full case, because people who are accused sometimes respond by moving assets further, canvassing sympathy, or destroying records. It felt odd to act like a conspirator against my own son. It felt necessary. In the private envelope where Richard had tucked his instructions, he had also left a note to Emily. While the legal machinery began to hum in the background, I sat at the kitchen table and read the note aloud, my voice low. It was not long or sententious. For Ellie and Emily, it said, if this day reveals the worst, let it also reveal the best. The collection belongs to those who will honor it. Keep it safe. Teach her. Emily was a gentle, earnest thing at 24, brighter, perhaps, than I had let myself notice when the fatigue of being a mother dimmed my attention to subtle growth. She was studying art history in another state and called me that evening, her voice small, as if she too had been holding her breath. I told her to come home. She booked the first train she could afford. She arrived with a duffel and a resolve that did not need spectacle. She did not ask to be given the collection. She asked how she could help. In her presence, the library felt less like a mausoleum and more like the beginning of a project, which is what Richard had wanted, to transform preservation into a task with a living purpose. We spent late hours in the house that week, drawing up inventories and filming the shelves, cataloging volumes by accession number in ways that would make an archivist nod. Dr. Harriet Simmons, who ran the small repository that had once housed some of our less fragile pieces, offered the use of a climate-controlled vault for the most valuable items. She arrived with the kind of discreet reverence librarians have for knowledge: gloves, a clipboard, a small lamp that made each page glow like treasure. "Keep it public-minded," she said when I told her about Richard's trust in a halting voice that tried to contain the whirlwind. "People need to be able to access what matters. Your collection is not for a room that smells only of loyalty." She tapped the edge of a folio and smiled. "Make it mean something." 2 nights later, with Diana's spreadsheet sprawled across the dining table and a tray of sandwiches going untouched, I heard the phone ring. It was a number I recognized at once. Andrew's. I let it go to voicemail because Catherine had advised against direct contact until we had an initial demand letter prepared. The phone's cold ring, one that expected to be answered by comfort and familial softness, sounded to me like an alarm I'd been trained not to avoid. Minutes later, a stream of messages arrived. Short, escalating. "Mom, pick up. Need to talk. Everything okay? Call me now." 2 messages were pleading. One was a little thinly veiled with entitlement. He had always been able to make urgency feel like necessity, and that had been part of his persuasive charm. I could have called back. I could have explained that I had found the withdrawals and that the lawyers would speak to his lawyers. I could have given him a softer landing, a chance to confess in private and make amends quietly. Instead, I did nothing for a long while. I sat with the sound of his voice in my head and the weight of Richard's handwriting on the table in front of me. I had, in a way, been given an opportunity that Richard had intended and that grief had never allowed. The chance to be exact about the consequences of choices rather than dramatic in response. Victor knocked on the kitchen door then, as if on cue, and stood in the doorway reading the unread messages over my shoulder. "Let it go to voicemail," he advised, his voice a neutral instrument. "We let them make the first move now that we have the facts." So I did. I let it ring out, and the unanswered notes piled up like confession slipped through a crack. They sounded smaller that way, diminished by the precise patient work of people who measure harm and have instruments to respond. It felt like letting a wound stop bleeding instead of ripping the scab off to see what cursive might spill out. That evening, as the house settled into its little noises, pipes, a clock, the soft respiration of warm rooms, I made a list, not of grievances, but of priorities. Secure the collection. Secure funds for the fellowship Richard had once joked about. A modest program for young curators we could set up in his name. Protect Emily. Decide what, if any, part of my relationship with Andrew could be salvaged in the long term. When I looked at my hands in the lamplight, hands that had once catalogued first editions, repaired torn spines with a delicacy learned over decades, I felt less like an old woman who had been robbed and more like a steward whose property had been mistreated. There is a difference between victimhood and stewardship. One flattens you. The other asks you to respond to what remains with intelligence. The next morning, the house filled with small, firm sounds. Diana clicking through spreadsheets, Catherine making notes, Victor placing calls to contacts at the banks who would listen to a familiar voice. We sent an immediate demand letter, short, factual, without rhetoric, asking for an explanation and a full accounting. We requested a temporary hold on transactions that matched the unauthorized patterns. When news of an inquiry leaks, no matter how discreet the letters are, people do what people always do. They talk. A cousin called with sorrow and a small fury. A neighbor left flowers at the gate and murmured about trust. An old friend from the library stopped by to offer sandwich-making services and moral clarity. The house felt busier, less complacent, as if the spirit of action had filled the rooms where complacency used to sit like a clock. Andrew called again that afternoon, and this time I decided to answer. His voice, when I picked up, was fuller than the voicemails had been. There was no shaking, no confession. "Mom," he said, the most neutral of greetings. "I got your message. What's going on?" I thought of the wilting roses. I thought of the photograph of them in front of the Eiffel Tower, their smiles bright in a place paid for by what I had put aside for the last years of my life. I thought of Richard's handwriting and the brass key, and how his will had been a careful engine of foresight. I thought of Diana's charts that reduced 9 years of kind explanations into a single, undeniable pattern. I told him, slowly and deliberately, "There are withdrawals going into accounts associated with you. We are investigating." There was a pause. It was the kind of pause that people use to build defenses. "What? Mom, that must be someone else. Something is mixed up." "It isn't mixed up, Andrew," I said. "Diana traced them. Victor has copies. Catherine will be in touch. We gave you until tomorrow to make arrangements." He laughed, a sound that tried for lightness and landed, for me, as a brittle thing. "Make arrangements? For what? Mom, this is ridiculous." "You will not have access to any of my accounts going forward," I said. The sentence felt like another reporting of facts. It had no flourish. It would be, I had decided, the benchmark against which future negotiations would be measured. "I have revoked any power of attorney you may have. I am asking you to return what was taken, or we will proceed with civil remedies." "You're bluffing," he said, trying for outrage and failing at first. Then the voice changed, slewing into a thin, wheedling register that sounded like a child hoping a parent had forgotten something. "Mom, it's not what you think. You don't understand the pressures We both knew pressures exist for everyone. They are not an excuse for theft." When I hung up, the house felt like a body that had just been told a diagnosis. It knew the word, and had not yet learned how to live with it. In the soft quiet that followed, between the hum of the refrigerator and the low tick of the mantel clock, I read Richard's letter again. He had written about choices, about small betrayals that calcify into ruin. He had hoped I would be practical. He had hoped that Emily would be trained to tend what's important. He had hoped that the betrayal would not define the rest of my life. Outside, the roses on the kitchen table were browning at the edges. Inside, a different kind of work had begun. We had drawn the first lines. The next steps would involve confrontation, evidence laid out where everyone could see it, and choices presented in the cold light of law and consequence. I had learned enough about life and libraries and men to know that there is a peculiar grace in showing your cards when you have nothing left to hide. The phone rang again that evening. I watched the display. Andrew's name lit up like a small, accusing beacon. Victor looked at me from across the table, his face unreadable. Diana paused with a pen poised over a spreadsheet. Catherine closed her file and lifted her eyes. "Let it ring," Victor said, and the word was not counsel so much as confirmation of strategy. I set the phone face down. It kept ringing, an insistence that asked me to choose between soft mercy and measured justice. The ringing slowed inside me until it was only the steady tick of that old mantel clock, like an echo of Richard's sense that time is the medium through which decisions are tested. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, with a brass key, a letter, and a flash drive, I was beginning to reconstruct a life that had been assumed by another. It was a small thing to call it beginning, but beginnings are what Richard had left me. They are also, I realized, an invitation to make the next 75 years something of my own. If you want to follow what happens next, if you want to see how evidence becomes a choice, and how a library can become a fortress of purpose, subscribe, and stay with me. The story is not finished, and the truth has a way of changing people. That night, Andrew left a message I chose, carefully, to listen to only once. His voice wavered between apology and deflection. "Mom, I can pay you back," he said. "I have some assets. Let him do what? Apologize? Make restitutions? Face consequences?" The options sat like unopened books on a shelf, their titles obvious but their contents not yet read. I did not call him back. I prepared instead to present the evidence. I prepared to protect the collection Richard had loved. I prepared, with people who had been calm in the face of anger and precise where most would have been theatrical, to ask the family for an answer that fit the scale of what had been taken. The next morning, the bank confirmed a temporary hold on several suspicious accounts. It was not a victory. It was a beginning. In the file Victor had assembled, the folders were thickening with copies of statements, screenshots of reservation emails, and Diana's careful marginal notes that translated money into motive. Each sheet felt like a small assertion that I mattered enough to defend. Late in the afternoon, as the light slanted the way it had on my toast the morning the roses arrived, there was a knock at the door. This time I did not open it with the naivete of a woman expecting cake and balloons. I opened it because I was certain of the person on the other side. Andrew stood on the porch with a bag slung over his shoulder, like a man who had been on the road and was not yet ready to apologize properly. Patricia was with him, her smile practiced, eyes searching mine for the softness I had no intention of giving easily. They had been expecting sympathy. They found instead a house that smelled faintly of old paper and new resolve. "I thought we should talk," Andrew began, as if the conversation were a natural extension of family life. "I thought we should do the accounting first," I answered. The words were short. They were careful. They were the kind that become the rules of engagement. "Sit down." They sat. The living room felt smaller and larger at once, constricted by the weight of what had been done and expanded by the clarity of people who had come prepared to listen or to be shown the facts. Diana laid out the chart. Victor sat quietly, the kind of silence that will not let you hide behind charm. Catherine observed, notebook closed but ready. Andrew opened his mouth to speak and then closed it, watching the figures as if the numbers had a life separate from him. Patricia's hand found his under the table, a small, companionable squeeze. For a moment I let the pity I felt for her, who perhaps had married into a house with expectations she had not fully known, sit like a ghost. But pity is not the same as indulgence. When Andrew finally spoke, his voice was a mixture of anger and pleading, a dialect I had heard before from a man used to negotiation. "Mom," he said, "I can explain. The debt, it was more than I told you. I didn't mean for it to—" "You mean to tell me your debt justified using my money without my knowledge," I interrupted. "You made choices." He shifted, as if being found out had been unexpected. "You know how things are, Mom. Opportunities come and go." "Opportunities don't take money from the bank accounts of those who love them," I said. The sentence landed, and for a moment the room was full of the small, stunned birds of consequence. He tried to make it about need. I made it about choice. Victor asked for an accounting. Catherine explained what restitution might look like, and Diana, graceful as a surgeon, laid out precisely how much had been withdrawn, how it had been spent, and where we might begin to follow it. Andrew listened with the kind of white-knuckled attention that suggests someone finally understands the cost of an action when it is translated into cold public figures. "Give me 24 hours, he said at last, in a softer voice that sought mercy and covenant at the same time. "Let me make arrangements. Let me—" 24 hours, I repeated, and in that repetition was a slow, judicial motion that felt like walking a room with a ruler. "You will have until then to begin restitution. After that, we will move to civil remedies." He looked at me then as if the face he had known all his life were suddenly an authority figure instead of a mother who forgave. I realized in that look that our roles had shifted as dramatically as any architectural plan Richard had drawn. I was no longer someone to be soothed. I was someone to be answered. The legal machinery would not fall neatly into place as I might wish, but it would begin to move, and in movement there is discovery and accountability. The door closed on them, and the house exhaled. I closed the ledger and turned off the lamps, and for the first time in a week I allowed myself to sit in the dark and feel the small victory of order. We had asked for an accounting. We had set a deadline. The rest, what the bank would do, what Andrew would choose, whether restitution would begin, or whether we would be forced into civil proceedings, remained to be seen. The phone rang again that night. I watched the number light up and felt, with an unexpected lightness, the steadiness of a woman who had made a choice not to be defined by betrayal, but to define the response to it. I let it ring until it stopped, and in the silence that followed I pictured shelves of books, their spines aligned like a choir, each title intact and accounted for, and a future where Emily and I would be the ones to steward what mattered into a world that still knew how to be reverent. Outside, the roses continued to brown. Inside, a more deliberate bloom had begun. The days that followed the deadline were measured in small, relentless things: notarized stamps, the scratch of pens, the shuffle of papers across my dining table. Andrew's 24 hours arrived and then stretched like a rubber band, taut and ready to snap. He called twice, left one message that tried for contrition and another that tried for bargaining. In person, he brought a paper bag with an attempt at humility, sandwiches from a cafe he thought I liked, and a face polished to look apologetic. He had promised to arrange restitution. What he delivered in that first meeting was a plastered-together plan, a modest wire transfer to my checking account, proof of an asset sale that had not quite closed, and an insistence that everything had been a mistake. He seemed astonished that the mistake had consequences. Patricia stood beside him, as if solidarity could turn arithmetic into absolution. Victor sat across from them like a man waiting for someone to finish a sentence. He already knew the ending, too. Diana had laid out exhibits on the coffee table, each page annotated, each sum reduced to a time and a place where someone had chosen to spend what did not belong to them. Catherine kept her face neutral, pen hovering above a legal pad, ready to transmute promises into enforceable terms. "We appreciate the transfer," Victor said, tipping his head toward the small screen where the bank confirmation blinked. "But what we need is a repair plan that addresses the full scope of the harm. Partial gestures are not a solution. They are signals." Andrew flushed. I'll sell other things. We'll liquidate. "You will not touch anything that could be considered part of this estate," Catherine said quietly. "No further transfers without account oversight, and you will sign an agreement to that effect today." He blinked, as if the words surprised him the way light surprises a room whose curtains are rarely opened. Perhaps more than anything, his surprise was that the house had rules and that the rules would be enforced. I had learned that the softest people sometimes make the hardest decisions when the stakes are clear. The warmth a mother might have extended evaporated in the presence of a ledger and the sight of Diana's meticulous columns. After a long, brittle negotiation that felt more like a ledger being balanced than a family conversation, he signed a document. It was a settlement agreement drafted by Catherine, careful and clear, with provisions for restitution, a timeline, and a clause that forbade him from accessing any of my accounts or any of the trust assets pending a court's review. Victor would be given oversight authority to monitor compliance. A portion of the recovery would be held in a restricted account, designated to seed what would become the Jenkins Fellowship. He signed with a hand that trembled at the end, not from remorse, but from the strain of having to make financial choices public. The papers sat between us like shallow stones on a riverbed, objects that would keep a current from sweeping everything away. It was not vindictive. It was math and consequence. After he left, I could hear the neighbors' footsteps, the mundane rituals of a community not yet reshaped by what had occurred within my walls. There were other things that had to be done. Some were practical and discreet. Catherine advised against broadcasting the settlement. Legal matters aside, the social fallout could provoke Andrew into desperate acts if he felt publicly compelled. We arranged a supervised transfer of the recovered sums into an escrow arrangement managed by Victor's firm and the bank's compliance department. The key to the trust, the literal brass object that had unveiled this hidden architecture, was placed for a time in Victor's custody, along with a certified copy of Richard's instructions. The flash drive was duplicated and encrypted. Diana made 2 backups and stored them in different safes. Everything had a chain of custody. Even the way my fingers touched the key when I handed it over felt like a ritual of trust, transferring an instrument from one steward to another. There were nights I lay awake cataloging the small injustices that had accumulated over the years, the dinners missed, the polite little deceptions that felt at the time like cushions for a bright future, the way affection can be translated into entitlement. I did not sleep as much as I cataloged, but the initial fury had softened into a keen, patient attention. There is work in attending to wrongs that is not about punishment. It is about setting things straight so that the future can be different. One of the next major steps was the repository meeting, what I had envisioned when I first held Richard's letter like a small divining rod. Dr. Harriet Simmons, who had been quietly supportive from the preface of all of this, convened the small board of the repository, where some of our most delicate items had been preserved. She led with a reverence that made me feel, absurdly, both like a culprit and a steward. "You have a story," she said in the conference room, her hands folded over the edge of a table that had held far fewer human dramas than it was about to. "Tell us how you'd like this collection cared for." So I told them. I told them about the first pamphlet Richard had brought home when we'd first married, about the way his eyes had lit up at the smell of old paper. I told them about the letters in the boxes that had once been ours alone, about the idea I had and he had shared, a fellowship for young curators, small grants to help those who could preserve detail in a world that prizes speed. There were nods and serious faces, and the sort of administrative questions I had always loved answering: how to catalog, how to ensure climate control, how to open doors to scholars without leaving treasures unguarded. Victor presented Richard's trust to the board. He did so with a clarity I had come to value. Legal documents can be made to sound like weather reports, objective, unavoidable. Richard Jenkins created a trust that is intended to protect the collection and make provisions for its stewardship, he said. He named Eleanor Jenkins as the protector, effectively the one with the authority to see that the trust's purposes are fulfilled. The instructions are explicit about opening the trust when Eleanor reached 75, and about appointing a curator to manage public access. He expected the possibility of familial conflict, and structured contingencies to prevent the collection from being dissipated. There was a roomful of silence after that, the kind that gathers when an old building creaks and everyone remembers what it's made of. The trustees leaned forward in their chairs, the way people lean into the stone of a church to hear a whisper. In practice, that meant there were legal steps, filings to be made, the appointment of a trustee if I chose to accept a formal role, the formal naming of a curator to run the day-to-day operations and serve as a public face for the collection. Dr. Simmons, when she looked at me, did not ask for permission. She simply offered, "We would be honored if you would serve as our chief curator, Miss Jenkins." I thought of the brass key. I thought of Richard's steady hand inked on a paper he had written years before, imagining the worst because he wanted me to be prepared for it. I thought of Emily, who had arrived with a duffel bag, and the sort of determined quiet that announces itself slowly, like a spring through winter. "I accept," I said. The words felt less like a proclamation, and more like the opening of a sabbatical I had not known I wanted. It was not merely the title. It was the ability to bind intention to action, to make the books live in the world again, and to ensure that money misappropriated would be returned to serve the purposes for which it had been intended. Emily stood then, cheeks flushed with the kind of excitement that still made her sound slightly younger than her years. "I'd like to be involved," she said. "I'd like to intern, learn, help catalog if you'll let me." I looked at her and saw, in the angle of her face as she watched the older people in the room, a hunger not for objects, but for meaning. Richard's note to her, "Teach her," had landed as an instruction. I had, until then, been half certain that I was doing this alone. The idea of handing it off, of teaching someone to love the work as I had, felt like the first honest pleasure after a betrayal. "Yes," I said, "let us teach." There were formalities. Catherine filed paperwork to effect the trust's opening and to register me, for the record, as the protector with authority to see that Richard's instructions were honored. Victor provided the custodial oversight he had promised. His firm worked with the bank to ensure that the recovered funds, plus a modest endowment from the trust that Richard had curated in secret, would be directed into a restricted account for the fellowship and for conservation work. These arrangements did not happen overnight, and they did not eliminate the complexities of family relationships. They were, however, a scaffolding on which the future could be built. Andrew kept to the settlement's terms in letter, if not always in spirit. He made payments, some direct and some assigned, through an escrow account. Patricia tried, in awkward, patient ways, to approach me at community events and to offer what passes for consolation in suburban life. I accepted only the social niceties at a distance. Forgiveness, I had learned, is a slow architecture. It cannot be rushed without collapsing into pretense. There were moments of quiet cruelty that I did not expect. A postcard arrived one morning, no return address, of the Eiffel Tower, its lights bright against a night sky. Someone had slipped it into my mailbox, as if to say the memory of that theft could be reduced to a souvenir. I kept the card and taped it into a small notebook, alongside a copy of Richard's first map of the library. Both, in their own way, were memorials to the work that had begun. Over the next months we moved methodically. Dr. Simmons and her team began the cataloging project in earnest. Emily learned how to condition check bindings and to read the subtle cues of marginalia that reveal the lives books have lived. Diana audited the recovered finances and prepared a report that became the fiscal statement for the fellowship, detailing how recovered funds, plus Richard's secret endowment, would seed a modest but meaningful grant program for aspiring curators. We wrote guidelines for access, for educational visits, for scholars who might wish to study the marginalia that made some of our volumes unique. The social dimension of the work surprised me. Local historians came forward with stories about the pamphlets. A retired professor donated his time to give lectures. A small college offered to host a symposium on archival preservation in Richard's name. The community that had once seemed peripheral to the private dramas of our living room now became a network of stewardship. It felt, in an odd way, restorative. Andrew attended one of the early meetings, not as a defendant, but as a donor whose contribution was still under the watchful eye of the agreement. He listened as Emily presented a plan to digitize part of the collection for public access. There was a moment, brief and fragile, when he appeared proud in a way that was not calculated. He sat with his chin in his hand, watching the young woman who shared his blood speak about outreach and education. For a small heartbeat, I allowed myself to think that perhaps there was a path forward that did not require theatrical absolution. But those moments were provisional. The settlement had boundaries. He was required to engage in financial counseling and to provide quarterly reports to Victor's oversight. It was not, Catherine reminded me, about moral victory. It was about risk management and making sure the collection and my well-being would not suffer further harm. The nuance sat in my chest like a small coin. Mercy and wisdom are not the same thing. 1 year after that morning, when the doorbell had rung at 8:17 and the roses had arrived already tired, the Jenkins Library held its first public gala. The house had been cleaned of its anxious dust. Tables were set with white cloths. The chandelier in the front room shone as if it had been restored specifically for the occasion. Friends, colleagues, and a few local paper reporters mingled in the rooms between the stacks, their conversations forming a low hum. Victor introduced the event with a formality that felt right. He spoke of stewardship and of the unusual set of circumstances that had brought us to a point where the collection could be preserved publicly. Diana, whose work had turned numbers into a narrative of restitution, sat at a table with a stack of reports that were, miraculously, mostly of historical interest rather than scandal. Catherine, who had what I imagine lawyers call a satisfied look, moved through the crowd like someone who had successfully made order from chaos. Emily stood at the podium where I had once given small talks about cataloging practices. She wore a dress that had belonged to my sister and spoke with a clarity that surprised even me. She announced the Jenkins Fellowship, and the room filled with applause when she described the first two recipients, young curators who would receive stipends and mentorship to work with our collection for a year. Andrew arrived that evening toward the end of the reception. He found me by the window where the light caught the dust motes like confetti, the same way it had that morning months ago. He looked older in a way that was not purely chronological. Your face ages when you have been required to look at yourself closely. Eleanor, he said, and it was the old name, soft as a key slid into a lock. Andrew, I answered, and my voice held the steady warmth I'd cultivated all along. He reached out, and for a moment we stood within the domestic choreography that binds family, an exchange of hands, a mutual recollection of shared laughter. He didn't ask for permission to touch the past. He did not deserve forgiveness on the spot. But he had been a complex figure in a larger story, not its sole villain. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," he began, "for everything, for how it happened and how bad I made it. I didn't mean it to become what it did." I looked at him for a long moment. There was no neatness in what he said. There were no promises that would erase 9 years of choices. But there was a change in the way he spoke. Less performance, more bone. That mattered. "I know," I said. "What matters now is what you do with the rest." He nodded, and we stood there, side by side, not reconciled but plausible. The room hummed around us, full of people who had come to see a collection preserved rather than a family spectacle. Outside the window, the evening had a faint, cool hush. Inside, the lights on the shelves made the spines gleam like promises made and kept. Time has a curious way of transforming what is raw into something that can be handled. It does not annul the past, but it allows for a reconfiguration of energy and purpose. The betrayal did not recede into myth. It became the hinge on which a new set of commitments turned. I learned to treat my life like a collection again, with care, with patience, and with the readiness to catalog the things that mattered most. 5 years later, the Jenkins Fellowship had produced 2 cohorts of curators and a modest online archive that made the collection accessible to scholars who could not travel. Emily had been named associate curator and now led the digitization project. She spoke at conferences with a calm authority that made me both proud and, in an honest way, relieved. The library had a small endowment from the recovered funds combined with Richard's hidden provision. It could now support conservation work and small grants. Dr. Simmons remained a steady presence, her hands still precise, her laugh gentler with years of success in the back rooms of preservation. Andrew's life had settled into something different. He had repaid a substantial portion of the funds designated in the settlement and continued mandatory counseling. He sometimes volunteered for community legal clinics, small things that did not absolve, but that suggested an attempt at repair. Our relationship was cautious and measured, governed by terms and mutual respect rather than intimacy. We would exchange occasional emails about family matters. We would attend the occasional event with Emily. The wound had not been erased, but the edges had been stitched in a way that allowed movement without collapsing into old habits. At the 5-year mark, we held a modest dedication ceremony for the Jenkins Fellowship's new reading room. The plaque on the wall read something appropriate and unostentatious about stewardship and memory. A small crowd gathered: trustees, friends, a couple of journalists drawn by the arc of the story, and the odd neighbor who had once left flowers at the gate. I stood beside Emily as she cut a ribbon, the pair of us small and serious under the chandeliers. People asked me afterward how I felt. My answers were never neat, because life rarely hands neat answers. I felt relief, of course, a practical kind that comes from seeing plans come to fruition. I felt a sense of repair in the small, measurable ways of a ledger: the fellowship funded, the collection conserved, scholarships granted. I felt sorrow, too, for choices that had been made, and for the loss of a different kind of relationship with my son. I felt fierce gratitude for what Richard had left me, and for the professionals who had helped turn an architectural plan into a living reality. There were times when I missed complacency. I missed the illusion that family always meant home and safety. But the transformation convinced me of something else. Age is not only an account of losses. It can be the ledger of a different set of gains. At 75, with a brass key and a stack of letters and a flash drive I had once thought unremarkable, I had been given the chance to redirect the story of our family's heritage into something public-minded. That was a privilege I did not squander. I often think of little days, the kind that otherwise hide in the middle of grand narratives. Emily and I would spend afternoons in the reading room, dust motes, little citizens of light. We would talk about marginalia, about the way an author's inked note years earlier suggested a mind grappling with the world. We would host interns who came with eager, ink-stained fingers. Sometimes, late at night, I would take out the brass key and feel its weight, a simple object that had been a hinge between betrayal and stewardship. There were quiet reconciliations that had nothing to do with apologies and everything to do with duty. Andrew attended one of the guest lectures and stayed in the back, eyes lowered. Afterward, he contributed, without fanfare, to a conservation fund for a particular folio that had been damaged. The act did not redeem him. It simply added a thin, useful thread to the fabric of repair. People are made of choices, some spectacular, some small. The latter often have the greater power to alter the shape of a life. When people ask me if I forgave Andrew, I answer with the truth that forgiveness and justice are not synonyms. Forgiveness is a private process that can be slow and partial. Justice, in the way I sought it, was organizational. It required measures, signatures, protections. I chose both a legal path and a moral stance. I did not surrender the past. I translated it into work that would help others. What astonished me in all of this was the discovery that the circle of care could widen. The collection, which had been a private conversation between Richard and me for so long, became public property in spirit, if not in right. Students from the local college who once could not afford to travel began to use the archive for dissertations. A retired teacher who had never seen an original folio in person came with a class, and we watched her pupils' faces tighten with the same wonder I used to feel when discovering a marginalia note that revealed a reader's heart. Those small faces and small moments were, in the end, the recuperation I had wanted. The money had not been the only thing stripped from me. The greater theft had been of possibility, how my later years could be spent. Restoring the collection and establishing the fellowship returned that possibility to me in ways I could not have imagined. On the 5th anniversary, we planted a small linden tree in the side yard, where the roses had once browned at the edges. I chose a spot where the sun would touch its leaves each afternoon, the way the light had fallen across my toast the morning the roses arrived. Emily and I watered it together. The tree was modest but steady, meant to be a marker, not of a single victory, but of a reclamation that took time and attention. When I look back on the moment now, the doorbell at 8:17, the photograph of a family toasting in Paris, the flash drive that held private plans, I find that the shock was only the first stroke of a longer painting. Betrayal gave way to a set of decisions, and those decisions led to a structure that allowed meaning to persist beyond harm. The work of stewardship is not a singular triumph. It is a sustained act, cataloging, protecting, teaching, and sometimes allowing one small branch of trust to be extended to those who earn it. In the quiet evenings with a cup of tea cooling beside me, I sometimes open Richard's letter and read the lines he had written in that slow hand of his. He had imagined many possible futures. Some of them were darker than the one I now occupied. Some contained a softer end than the one that had unfolded. He had given me tools, not guarantees. That, I think, was his most precise kindness. The belief that I could take a set of instruments and make them do what ought to be done. The title of this story, My Son Stole My Savings for Paris, The Shocking Betrayal on My 75th Birthday, describes the rupture. It names the hurt, but the ending is not merely the account of a theft. It is also, and perhaps more importantly, an account of reclamation. A small trust, a brass key, a quiet curator. These were the means by which a life was rebuilt, not on revenge, but on stewardship, on purpose, on the desire to place the collection in service of something larger than private desire. If you find yourself in a place where trust has been tested, by family, by friends, by institutions, remember that betrayal can be a teacher. It will not give you consolation. It will give you a test and the chance to make choices that determine the next chapter. For me, those choices led to a library full of voices, to a fellowship that seeds future caretakers, and to a granddaughter who handles fragile pages with a confidence that promises continuity. What would you do in my place? Share what you would choose below. If this story moved you or gave you hope that age can be the beginning of a new purpose, subscribe to follow more stories like this one.